All right, so I am Almaz Zelleke, and I am very happy to be back at NABIG. I haven't been to an NABIG in a few years. I've been living in China, and it's been very exciting to watch what has been happening on the basic income front in the United States and Europe and Canada from afar. And so I wanted to talk today a little bit out of my comfort zone. I'm a political scientist with a specialty in political theory, so I'm not an activist, I'm not a mobilizer, I don't have any experience in organizing, but I thought that at this juncture in the evolution of the basic income debate, it was important to start thinking about how we translate some of the ideas we've been thinking about, talking about at conferences like these, into possibilities for action and for political mobilization. So that's my tentative foray outside my comfort zone. So I've titled this presentation Basic Income for Realists, and it's been inspired by a couple of things. One is some recent work by political scientists, Christopher Aachen and Larry Bartels, in their 2016 book, Democracy for Realists. I don't know how many of you have read this book or heard about it, but what Aachen and Bartels suggest is that voters do not vote according to either their rational interests. So they do not think, well, what are my policy preferences, and now let me find a politician or a party that represents those policy interests the best and vote for them. So they're not voting in a kind of prospective rationality, and they're not, according to the evidence that Aachen and Bartels provide, voting rationally retrospectively either. Right? So this were the two main pillars of democratic theory. It's either that voters are choosing politicians on the basis of their policy preferences, or they are making kind of a guess as to who will best represent their interests, and then retrospectively they will either maintain them in office or kick them out, depending on how they've done in terms of meeting those preferences. So the Aachen and Bartels say that actually none of the evidence on voting supports either of these theories. So how do voters vote? Well, the strongest evidence seems to suggest that they vote in terms of very, very short-term economic interests. Short-term meaning in the last few months before the election. And so you can have great 3 years of economic activity, but if the economy starts to tank in the last year, you're going to get thrown out. And then they go further and say that partisan loyalties, affiliation to parties, is based also less on this question of alignment with policy preferences and more in alignment with our social identities and our group identities. And so this to me poses a challenge for basic income, especially for somebody who is a political theorist, right, who thinks about the rational reasons why we as academics, but also as voters, should support a basic income. If we can't make the argument to the voters on the basis of their rational self-interest in voting for a basic income, what can we do? So that was kind of the inspiration for what I'm doing today. Second inspiration is actually a paper that was presented at the 2015 NABIG. I wasn't here, but I read the paper online in the discussion paper series, and it was by Brent Rinaldi, and I don't know him. Is he here? Very nice to meet you. So apologies in advance if I distort anything that you said. I'll give you the first question to correct anything that I do wrong. But Brent Rinaldi wrote a paper about the Townsend movement and presented it a couple of years ago. And I found this paper very interesting. I have to confess, I really didn't know much about the Townsend movement until I saw that paper and started to hear about it in the news right around the same time, with people making comparisons to the basic income idea and the Townsend movement of the 1930s. And then I also wanted to look at evidence from the welfare rights movement of the 1960s. And I know that there are several people at this conference who were involved in that movement as well. Apologies again to anything that I say that is distorting or incorrect based on their experience. But I am doing my best to learn about both of these movements now, to think about how we can apply some of the lessons learned to what might be a real political movement for basic income today. So if you want to know more about these two movements, these are some excellent resources that I recommend. I'm not going to say too much about the details of the movements because of time limits here. There's more information in my paper, but also more information in these resources. And of course, there are many other resources, but these are just some of the ones that I found most useful here. Obviously, Brent's paper, and then the book by Edwin Amenta, which I think provided a lot of the background for Brent's paper as well on the Townsend Plan, and a couple of books on the National Welfare Rights Organization in the United States. So I want to say again, just as a sort of cautionary note, I'm not as interested in, and I'm not really capable of assessing these movements on the basis of what they say for the actual mobilization of a membership organization. That's not my area of expertise. I'm really interested in looking at how these movements framed the policies that they were in favor of, how they mobilized support in a general sense, not in an organizational sense, but in a sort of a political sense about getting people behind the ideas. So again, with apologies for any mistakes that I'm making, since the author's in the room, the lessons that Brent Rinaldi takes from the Townsend movement about what it did well was that it harnessed existing discontent. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously since I haven't said anything about it, but the Townsend movement was a movement for universal pensions in the 1930s, so during the Great Depression in the United States. So there was clearly a lot of economic insecurity and distress, and the Townsend movement was able to harness that distress with a proposal for a universal pension at $200 a month, which was quite a large sum for the time. The conditionality on that universal pension was that seniors would give up their jobs so that younger working-aged people could take those jobs, and that they would spend the money every month so that the money would provide a stimulus to the economy. So it was called a revolving pension plan because the idea was that the pensions would go to the seniors, but then the money would circulate in the economy because they had to spend it right away, and because they were giving up their jobs, other people would get their jobs. So it, in Amenta's terms, it was able to sort of diagnose a problem, an existing problem, and provide an appropriate policy prescription for that problem. The Townsend movement also harnessed the middle class. So it's a fascinating story, right? This is a movement that had, I think at its peak, about 2 million members in the United States at a time when the population of the United States was 120 million, something like that. So it was a large social movement, and it was primarily based on the members were seniors, and they were, in the economic context of the time, they were not doing very well, but they were in terms of affiliation, they felt like they were members of the middle class. It's probably a little bit anachronistic to use that term there, but they were not the poorest of the poor, right? So these were people who had the kinds of aspirations and social ties of the middle class. So they were very primed for being organized and to network to build the organization. The Townsend movement worked across party lines. It was happy to endorse or oppose Democrats or Republicans, depending on whether they supported the Townsend Plan or not. I think, Brent, you suggested this was an advantage of the Townsend movement. I think this is some place where I would disagree. I think this turns out to be a little bit of a disadvantage. They were, I think, a little bit too ready to switch party lines, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. Also, they recruited the biographically available, by which, by that term, what is meant is that the seniors, because they were seniors, they had a lot of time on their hands. They weren't out looking for work as hard as, let's say, the working-aged or people with young children would have been. Significantly, I think the Townsend movement appealed to both self-interest and altruism. And I think this is very important for the basic income movement. So the self-interest is obvious. Seniors would get a pension that would relieve their economic insecurity. Clearly that appealed to their self-interest and was a big motivating factor for joining the Townsend clubs and being part of the movement. But they also appealed to altruism in the sense that the seniors were going to be doing a patriotic duty in stimulating the economy, in giving up their jobs, and in spending the money, stimulating the economy, giving jobs to younger people, right? So it was really a package that was both about the self-interest of the seniors, but also viewing them as economic agents, important economic agents in the economy at the time. Okay, finally, this question mark, this is actually Brent's question mark, right? It's not a little unsure in the paper about whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, an advantage or a disadvantage, that the Townsend movement didn't really have a good idea or a good story about how to pay for it. Didn't seem to hurt the organization, the mobilization of the members, that there was no plausible plan really for paying for the pensions. And in fact, when we think about basic income and the fact that it's going to have to raise taxes on some people, right? Some people are going to be net payers and some people are going to be net beneficiaries. How do we make the case to the net payers if we're really honest about what the financing is going to be? Well, the Townsend movement wasn't 100% clear about what the financing would be, and so that enabled them to build that organization, but it hurt their credibility when their bills actually got to Congress. So Edwin Amenta, who wrote a book on the Townsend movement, is a sociologist, and he looked at the Townsend movement from the perspective of social organization building. And he says that what's important for building a social movement is, in terms of actually achieving the benefits that you want to get for your members, is you have to go through these sort of 4 steps, right? So your issue has to become part of the political agenda. You have to be able to influence the content of legislation. You have to be part of passing that legislation. It has to be passed, and then you have to implement it. And he notes that there are very important constraining factors, particularly in the United States. The political institutions are set up to really make it very hard for what he calls challengers to change social policy in any significant way in the United States. We can talk more about that, but I think that's probably pretty clear to most people in the room, especially given the fact that we've had several Congresses now that have really done almost nothing. The political context is clearly important, right? So social movements are going to be successful, more or less successful, depending on what the political context is. The Townsend movement had a very favorable political context for many reasons. And then he says it's important that organizations match their assertiveness, by which he means the kind of protest or electoral influence that they want to exert on candidates, opposing or supporting candidates. It's important that they match that assertiveness to the political context. If you're too assertive in a context that isn't favorable, you're not really going to achieve anything, right? So the means have to match the context. Okay, so now this is really my take based on all the things that I've read about the Townsend movement. And the strengths were that the pensions were on the political agenda, and that was obviously meant it was a fertile time to build a movement like this that was advocating for universal pensions. The political context was favorable, with a Democratic President Roosevelt, in the White House, and Democratic majorities during much of the time in the Congress. There was, as I said before, a plausible diagnosis and prescription, right? The country was in economic distress, and in retrospect, it's easy to say it needed a lot of stimulus spending. And Roosevelt was committed to that intellectually, but in fact, many of the policies that he enacted early on in his tenure as president did not do as much stimulus as they could. For example, when he enacted Social Security legislation in 1935, he started with the tax, right, the payroll tax, but there were no benefits paid out yet, right? So we're actually taking money out of the economy rather than stimulating the economy. And the Townsend Plan had an answer for that. As I said earlier, the Townsend movement had a broad middle-class membership that was able to be politically activated, right? When they were told to write letters to their congressmen, they were ready and able to do so. And as I said earlier, the Townsend Plan appealed both to self-interest and to altruism. On the other hand, I think the weaknesses are that it had a weak form of bipartisanship. What I mean by that is that the movement was focused on their policy, right? They wanted that policy enacted, and they would work with whoever was willing to endorse the policy. So they would endorse or oppose candidates for the House, depending on whether they would essentially sign a pledge to support the Townsend policy, right? And so they were able, because they had these politically active members in several districts, able to pressure both Republican and Democratic congressmen to endorse the Townsend Plan in areas where they had membership strength. But what that meant was that, particularly on the Republican side, the Republicans were able to simply vote vote positively on legislation related to the Townsend Plan, but not really work very hard for it. They did what they said they were going to do, but they weren't really committed to other progressive measures that might have helped to achieve some of the goals of the Townsend movement without specifically achieving that particular policy. So it's certainly, as Andy Stern said last night, it's important for us to, I think, work across party lines, not make this a particularly partisan issue. On the other hand, when we're thinking about actually working with politicians, I think the lesson of the Townsend movement is that, in fact, you do need to choose a party and be willing to work with that party in a broad sense to get their support behind you and to get support for policies that might achieve some of the goals, even if they aren't exactly the policy that you want. I think it's pretty clear from the literature that the fact that they had no plausible funding plan was a problem in getting their bills enacted. So they were able to get legislation introduced in Congress, but the funding was never really very clear. We can talk about what the funding plan was in questions if people are interested. In addition, and I think related, they failed to activate support outside the movement and outside Congress, right? So they didn't have economists on their side, they didn't have policymakers on their side, and clearly it's a different context in the 1930s than it is in the contemporary world, where there are think tanks and there are conferences like this and so on, where policy is debated very broadly and people can do lots of studies to support or oppose different kinds of policies, but they didn't have a strategy, I think, for reaching out to people beyond the congressmen and their own movement members. And I think most importantly, they were rigidly committed to the idea of the $200 a month pension. And so when alternative policies and bills came up that had lower pensions, but that would have been a big step ahead for the seniors, were introduced, they opposed them. They opposed President Roosevelt on almost everything that he did in trying to expand social policy. So in the end, they really, I think they lessened the impact of their voice by being so rigidly tied to the one plan, or the $200 pension. Okay, turning to the NWRO, the National Welfare Rights Organization, which was an organization of welfare recipients in the United States and Canada, as well, had the same kind of movement, and they were active only for a few years, from about 1966 to 1972 in the United States. At first, they were primarily committed to local activism to improve and increase welfare payments to recipients by working through the offices and really flooding the offices with protests to try to get some of the discretionary funds that were available but were not generally dispersed to be more generously dispersed. But toward the end of their time as an organization, they did turn to supporting a guaranteed minimum income, and I'm sure many of you in this room know about the guaranteed minimum income movements of the 1960s, so I won't spend too much time on that. But just to run through again the strengths and the weaknesses that I see from what I've read about the movement, is that, again, welfare reform and GMI were on the political agenda, so the political context was strong in that sense. It wasn't as strong as it was for the Townsend movement because they had a Republican president in office for much of the time that they were active, especially toward the end, which was President Nixon. Although President Nixon was interested in social policy more in his first term in office than he turned out to be in the second term, short second term. Again, there was a plausible diagnosis and prescription. Welfare payments were too low to really support families at an adequate level, but they were appealing only to self-interest. There really wasn't a larger appeal to altruism, right? There wasn't really much discussion of how increased increased welfare payments to welfare recipients would be part of a larger good. I don't think that case was made convincingly enough. Again, there was really no plausible funding plan. The GMI that was proposed by the NWRO was for $5,500 a year for a family of 4, compared to $1,600 plus about a little under $1,000 in food stamps under Nixon's plan. They failed to. Okay, yeah, sorry. Anyway, we can talk more about that. I do think that they, again, were very rigid in their adherence to a particular policy rather than to the larger goals. So one of the things that I want to do with this work is to think about the framing issues and the priorities that the basic income movement will have to make some tough decisions on. There are different ways that we can frame the basic income, and I think that those will have different effects in terms of our political success. I also think that, as Andy Stern said last night, we really have to have a plausible funding program, and I think we need to do some work in getting real numbers about not so much what the long-term effects would be of income security on the way we work and what our economy is like, which I think is, as Michael Lewis said, it's really hard to predict, but I do think we can think about what the cost would be, at least in the short term, by doing some work on what the tax and benefit implications are. And I do think that one of the things that neither the Townsend movement nor the NWRO did successfully was to really think about what the principles were in order to articulate the principles in terms of what they were working for rather than just the policy itself. And so I think that one of the things I'd like to suggest, and again this is very tentative, is that the basic income movement should accept a kind of principled incrementalism, which is that we want to prioritize unconditionality, universality, and individuality over the size of the grant. That would be my suggestion, but really just as a starting point for conversation. So thank you very much.